Ladies and gentlemen, dear viewers, my name is Danylo Lubkivsky. On behalf of the Kyiv Security Forum, I welcome you to this discussion. We are discussing today one of the biggest threat for Ukraine, the threat of a new attack from Russia. Over the last few weeks, the escalation of aggressive actions of Russia against Ukraine has been in the focus of attention of the world. The build-up of military troops of Russia on our borders and the killings of our military. Russia wants to deliver blow to Ukraine, and we are resisting this together with the West. We have very important participants in this discussion today, politicians and experts who are shaping our relations with the European Union, the US, Canada, Great Britain, Latvia, and Estonia. Let me introduce our guests. Ms. Sandra Kalniete, European and Latvian politician, member of the European Parliament, Vice-Chairwoman of the group of the European People's Party, ex-Minister of Foreign Affairs. Diane, Canadian author and editor, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, Mr. David Kramer, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, American diplomat and international policy expert, James Sherr, British and international security and foreign policy expert, senior fellow of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, and Arseniy Yatsenyuk, head of the Kyiv Security Forum and the Prime Minister in Ukraine in 2014 and 16.
Actions. Russia indicates that it may at any time start a full-scale war against Ukraine. Ukraine's officials say that Russia had massed more than 40,000 troops on Ukraine's eastern border and more than 40,000 in Crimea. They upped their military presence with Iskander missiles, howitzers, and other heavy weapons. White House says that Russia now has more troops on our border than at any time since 2014. The Kremlin waged a global disinformation campaign accusing Ukraine of preparing an offensive. Dmitry Kozak, Putin's deputy chief of staff, said Moscow might be forced to intervene, and this would be the beginning of the end for Ukraine. So Russia provokes and raises tensions. They threat not only Ukraine, obviously, but the West, the European Union, NATO, and the Biden's administration. The Pentagon says it monitors the situation very closely. Chairman of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff communicated with his Russian counterpart. Throughout Europe, the United States forces raised their alert status. It was reported that Washington would send 2 warships to the Black Sea, but later this decision was cancelled. On the 2nd of April, President Biden called President Zelensky, expressing the United States' unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Group of 7, NATO, and the European Union called on Russia to refrain from escalating tensions. President Biden called Vladimir Putin and made his position very clear. The United States stands by Ukraine. Yesterday, Washington imposed more sanctions on Russia for its interference into the American domestic affairs. And the direction of travel looks very clear. There can be far more sanctions. We could have gone further, but I choose not to do so. I choose to be proportionate, President Biden said in his yesterday's address. At the same time, experts say that there are more limited impact. Is a sign that Biden's administration is trying to tone down the conflict with Russia. That's what Thomas Graham, Russia's advisor to President George W. Bush, said in his analysis for the Wall Street Journal. President Biden has also invited Putin to hold a bilateral meeting. So this is the picture. Putin escalated tensions and amassed his pressure on the West. The West stood up by Ukraine, but gave a signal to Russia that the situation must be calmed down. The signal was obviously heard, but not necessarily accepted. Today, in Paris, Mr. Zelensky starts his meeting with President Emmanuel Macron of France and will hold trilateral talks with German Federal Chancellor Angela Merkel. So let me start by asking Arseniy Yatsenyuk. Mr. Yatsenyuk, don't you find, taking into account all this big picture, that there is a danger that in order to calm down the tensions, Western governments, time and again, would try to convince President of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, to accept in some form the Putin's version of peace and his demands. And that might be one of the Kremlin's goals, even worse than its potential military threat. What would be your opinion, Mr. Yatsenyuk?
In 2013, I said to then President of the United States and then Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden, in the Oval Office, that Ukraine will never surrender. I can repeat this once more. We will never surrender. And Ukraine today defends the world. Ukraine today is fighting for its territorial integrity and sovereignty and defending and protecting the European Union and the entire free world. And everyone is to realize this in different capitals, because you, Danylo, mentioned a number of times Washington, but you never mentioned Brussels. You just said once about the European Union, which is quite disappointing for me. Putin's regime is an acute threat for the world, for the US, for Ukraine, and for the European Union. It reminds me of my talks with the then Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, when in 2007 I showed her a map of Ukraine, which was encircled by Russian troops in Russia, Belarusian, which are practically pro-Russian troops in Belarus, and Transnistria. Today, and even I mentioned at that time Russian troops that were deployed in Crimea. Today, Ukraine is completely encircled with an aggressive Russian military, and this huge build-up, massive build-up of the Russian troops at the Ukrainian borders. It's not just that Russian military is at the Ukrainian doors. No. Putin as Russian military, they are already in the Ukrainian house, and this is completely different. So Ukraine needs support, and I want to be very clear in the message both to the United States and to our European friends. What we need a lethal weapon. We need joint military drills. We need non-lethal weapon. We need military assistance. We need technical assistance for the Ukrainian military. In terms of political support, it's obvious that Ukrainian people strongly believe that our future is in NATO and in the European Union. We are very pragmatic, and we are not naive. And I fully understand that we can get this membership on a fast track. But we started this process in 2008, and as the Speaker of the House, I signed a letter to NATO together with then President and Prime Minister asking for membership action plan for Ukraine. It's a high time right now to deliver this, what was promised in Bucharest in 2008. In terms of today's talks with Mr. Macron, we strongly believe that Mr. Zelensky will not bring any kind of new notorious Minsk deal or notorious Budapest deal from this meeting in Paris. And I expect that President of France will be as firm, as strong as President of the United States, defending the values of the free world and protecting and defending Ukraine against the Russian aggression.
I thank you, Mr. Yatsenyuk. Mr. Weber, Manfred Weber, the leader of the European People Party in the European Parliament, recently called the European Union and the United States to impose stricter sanctions on Russia if the situation deteriorates. Among other things, he demands the large-scale freezing of oligarchs' accounts and assets and disconnecting Russia from SWIFT. I turn now to Ms. Sandra Kalniete, and I thank you very much, Ms. Kalniete, for being with us. Ms. Kalniete is the former foreign minister of Latvia and the member of the European Party and Parliament and the European People Party. So, Ms. Kalniete, what should be the Kremlin's price if it decides to invade Ukraine? You're welcome.
Dear friends, for me it is really honor to take part in this discussion in a very tough period we are facing all. We are approaching to major international crisis, and I hope that everyone in Europe understands that this is a serious threat, not only to Ukrainian sovereignty, but also to European stability and security. Yes, it's true. European People's Party wants European Union and United States clearly and explicitly communicate to Russia the price it will have to pay for its aggression, and it has to be very high. Freezing of Nord Stream 2, which is a very important pipeline for Ukraine and also for Baltic states. There must be asset freezes and travel bans for pro-Kremlin oligarchs, propagandists, and also their family members. And regarding SWIFT, that is like a nuclear bomb if it is used. But besides that, we have to, if Russia commits further aggression against Ukraine or other neighbors, expanding its policy of, I call it creeping occupation, then EU and United States, we must take next step in assisting Ukraine militarily, providing aid for capability development, and modernizing your military equipment. And this includes also provision of defensive lethal weapons. And I regret that United States decided to suspend for time being the sending of US destroyers to Black Sea, but I believe that they have to be sent, and also European military assets have to be employed in the Black Sea. Besides all that, we know we need to pursue a robust concrete steps as expelling, for instance, Russia from the Council of Europe if there is an aggressive act, freezing and restricting all Western investments into Russia, and ban US and the EU from financial institutions from trading in newly issued Russian state debt and bonds. We have to expand the list of companies who are subject to sanctions, including asset freeze and prohibition of all financial transactions. And also we have to apply financial restrictions to Gazprom, Rosneft. We have to, until now, Russia's state-owned banks have not been blocked, and there are no sanctions, but we have to consider also this step. And finally, we have to sanction Sovcomflot shipping concern, key player in energy sector. And to conclude, I just want to reiterate again that Ukraine is by no means alone. Ukraine has friends, partners, and allies in Europe and across the international community, and we stand with you.
I do thank you, and I thank you very much for such a strong, clear, and straightforward position. And now we turn to the United States. So yesterday, on Thursday, the Biden's administration met yet another bold step and imposed additional sanctions on Russia in response to Moscow's election interference, a widespread hacking campaign, and other malign activity. Mr. David Kramer, who is with us, is a famous American diplomat and policy expert. And David, I thank you that you join our discussion. How do you assess the decision taken so far by the White House to deter Russia? How do you assess this kind of balance that President Biden would like to proceed with, imposing sanctions, but also giving a hand of a room for some kind of talks with Putin? And what scenarios do you envisage right now? You're welcome.
Danylo, thanks so much, and it's an honor to be on this panel with such distinguished colleagues here. And I'm sorry not to be there in person, but hopefully before too long we can all gather together. I think yesterday's step was a good step. A second step is, keep in mind, the Biden administration imposed sanctions on 7 individuals last month over the poisoning and arrest of Alexei Navalny. So this is step number 2. It's a bigger step than the first one, but it's still not enough, in my view. The part dealing with Russian sovereign debt was arguably the most important part and the most influential part of the sanctions package that was unveiled. There were 10 Russian agents who were expelled or going to be expelled from the United States as well. But the list of individuals who were sanctioned is not a list that most people would recognize. And that's where I regret that the administration did not go after people much closer to Putin and within his circle. And I think that needs to be done. I also think that sanctioning a number of state-owned enterprises, including a number of banks, some of their subsidiaries have been sanctioned, but not yet the outright enterprises themselves. Those need to be targeted as well. And I think we also have to get past being so responsive to the steps that Putin takes. We need to try to preempt and block what he might do in Ukraine, with Navalny, wherever it might be. And instead, we tend to be far too reactive and we tend to be too slow. The United States, I think, should work closely with our European allies, with our Canadian allies. But there may be times where the United States needs to go it alone, and we should be prepared to do so. Unity would be great. No one's against it, but we also shouldn't settle for the lowest common denominator. And that sometimes is what happens when we hold back and try to present a transatlantic united approach. On the statement that was issued Tuesday by the White House following the phone call between President Putin and President Biden, I was struck by a few things. One, there was no mention of Navalny, which I think was a glaring omission. Second, it led with interest in having strategic stability talks with Russia. Frankly, I'm not sure those are going to lead to anything. Second on the list was talk of Ukraine. And there the language was good and strong, as it has been, including when President Biden called President Zelensky and Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin called their respective Ukrainian counterparts. I do think rhetorically, the administration's support has been very strong and very laudatory. But at the same time, the reference to a summit, I think, was a mistake. Perhaps if they had said meeting, I would have been less alarmed. When you have a summit, summits tend to produce deliverables. I can't imagine what deliverables would come out of a Biden-Putin meeting. Moreover, when President Biden was asked a few weeks ago by George Stephanopoulos of ABC News here whether he thought Putin was a killer or not, President Biden, correctly in my view, answered yes. Therefore, it strikes me as really hard to envision a summit or a meeting between President Biden and President Putin when this issue wouldn't come up. And so unless President Biden is prepared to say in response to a journalist question in a joint press conference, do you think President Putin is a killer? And unless he's prepared to say yes with Putin standing right next to him, they shouldn't meet. We need to lower our expectations that we can find common ground with the Putin regime. My view is that as long as Putin is in power, we will be very limited in the common ground that we can find. In fact, I'm not sure there will be much. I give the Biden administration credit for extending the New START treaty very early in its administration. That was a good thing. That now can't be held hostage by Putin over us. And now with that out of the way, I really think we need to rein in our expectations for further arms control discussions. And we should recognize that as long as Russia, or the Putin regime, I should say more accurately, as long as the Putin regime threatens its own people, threatens its neighbors, including Ukraine, and threatens us through cyber attacks and election interference, and what it's doing in Syria, Libya, the list is endless. We really should pull back on any hopes of finding common ground with Mr. Putin.
Thank you, David. And continuing this line of our discussion, now I wish to invite Diane Francis, a well-known Canadian and American author and editor. A few days ago, you published a remarkable article which is called "We All Are Ukrainians." Diane, you mentioned there that President Putin has already accomplished what he needs, namely to divide the West. You conclude that there must be no compromise. it's time, you say, for draconian measures against an odious regime, because Putin's targets are not simply, you say, Navalny and Ukraine. We all are at risk. We all are Navalny. We are all Ukrainians. So what is your assessment? How do you see the general situation and its perspectives? And how do you see the tactics that Biden's administration decided to choose? You're welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Excuse me, I'm a little hoarse. I want to start by just giving a very brief background. I'm a journalist, but I'm also a person. I've written 4 books on white-collar crime and many books on geopolitics, and I'm with the Atlantic Council and so on. And I've written a lot about Ukraine. I've been there 30 times. I've covered both revolutions. I've been to the war front. I first interviewed Kravchuk, who was the first president of an independent Ukraine in 1992. So I go back a long way, and many of my friends are Ukrainian, and my great-grandfather was Ukrainian. So that's my background. I love the people. I love the country. And in Canada, Canada is the largest Slavic country in the world outside of Europe. About 15 or 20% of Canadians are Polish or Ukrainian or Slavic. So it's a very important diaspora that is watching keenly whatever goes on. Although, you know, Canada is relatively powerless to do much in the world scene because of the size of the country. Now, what I wanted to emphasize here is that having been an observer and watcher and participant, by the way, I owned a newspaper briefly in '95 in Ukraine that was stolen from us with baseball bats by an oligarch. And my editor-in-chief was nearly beaten to death. So that's my experience with Ukraine. And so I'm very, very happy to see that Ukraine has slowly started to of course, turn to the West, which was what the Revolution of Dignity was all about, but also recognize that's its trajectory, but also to develop itself in many ways with reforms. So I applaud all the reforms that have gone on so far. They're not enough, but we're going in the right direction. As far as Biden, I am horribly disappointed. This is a guy who I thought had the guts to follow through in calling him a killer with killer responses. You know, we know what Putin is, and Biden should, but he doesn't. And no American president, in my estimation, has, nor has any European leader. What you're dealing with is not a person who will abide by agreements. Oh, he'll negotiate agreements and then ignore them. He's not a person you invite to a summit. He'll go to the summit, but he'll ignore the agreements. This is not a person you can deal with. You have to think like Putin and act like Putin to not defeat him, but to stop him in his tracks where he is. And the naivete of the American presidents, one after the other, Bush, Obama, Clinton, all of them, is now evident in the advice that's being funneled into the current president of the United States, who should know better. So what I'm saying is that my disappointment was he gave sanctions that were very soft. By the way, the financial sanctions, there's a workaround. I understand investment. There's a workaround, and already American brokerage firms are recommending people invest in the bonds that were sanctioned and giving them the way to work around the sanctions. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is so naive. The next thing is he asked them to de-escalate. And what did they do? They've ordered, you know, the Ukrainian Navy to stay out of Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea. They've now blockaded the choke points at the Kerch and at the other choke points. And the Americans, you know, didn't put their warships into the Black Sea. I mean, he's already escalated after the President of the United States said in his speech, de-escalate, which is the only strong thing he said. So now the ball is in Biden's court. This is Putin's game. So now the ball is in Biden's court. What is Biden going to do? What is he going to do? Well, what I say is he's got to think and act like Putin. So what I suggested in my newsletter yesterday on Ukraine, which was a follow-up, is that to beat Putin, you have to think and act like Putin. So imagine you were Putin in the White House. What would you do about Putin? Well, the first thing you would do is you'd accelerate Ukraine's membership into the European Union. You would lobby for that. You would put them into the NATO. You would put troops in Ukraine to protect, to match the troop escalation on the other side of the border. You have to behave like Putin.
Thank you, Diane. We will talk about this, about your second piece a little bit later. But before we do this, let me invite James Sherr, and I thank you very much for your opinion. And I would like to invite James Sherr to join the discussion. And James is a well-known British and international security and foreign policy expert who is now the senior fellow of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. James, I have the most difficult part for you. Sorry for this. In your opinion, what is an actual aim of the military buildup of President Putin near Ukraine? So what kind of picture you see? What is the real aim? And what do you expect to see from the Kremlin in the nearest future? You're welcome.
For Russia, armed forces and military force are always instruments of policy. The fact is, as I think we know, in the Russian interpretation of the Minsk Accords, they were meant to accomplish the insertion of overt opponents of Ukrainian statehood into Ukraine's structures of power. And over 7 years, the gap has not narrowed. There has been no compliance, and despite Russia's expectations, even Ukraine's principal European partners have not put pressure on Ukraine to comply. So what happened? In January this year, Lavrov issued what he called an ultimatum to Britain and France and effectively said, if you do not make Ukraine comply and behave, we will. And it has been since then that we have seen the steady proliferation and gradual escalation of military activity. So that's point one that I would make. Point two, the Russians going back centuries have been masters at massing, mobilizing forces for the purpose of frightening their opponents to death and making them come to the table and say, what do you want? Give me a paper to sign. So it remains very possible that the principal purpose of all of this is coercive intimidation. But I see no signs that it is working, and I don't think it will work. The Russians also understand that often the best way of frightening your opponents to death is to actually use military forces, particularly where your opponent is weak and they do not perceive anyone militarily strong behind them. And this is where the Biden administration, its tonalities, its rhetoric, its actions, its inactions play a critical role. Part of what is going on, in my view, is a way of testing Biden. It was one of the first things I thought would happen after he was elected, that Putin would find a way to test him. They have heard up to now the rhetoric, they have watched the body language, but they're asking, where is the substance there? Is there any? What are they willing to commit? What are they willing to risk? And they understand perfectly well that behind this, the United States faces a monumental challenge, even in immediate terms, with China and Taiwan. So this is why the situation is so both nerve-wracking and inconclusive. Final point, look at the forces that are there. Well, they are very frightening, but if you want to launch a deep offensive into Ukraine, which of course Russian experts and officials, retired officials love to talk up, to the Dnieper and so on and so forth, you need a tail to all of this and an infrastructure which is not there if you want to do this and occupy land. What you can do very effectively with the forces that are there, and serious Ukrainian experts have discussed this, and I agree with them, is replace this motley Russian commanded force on the demarcation line of the so-called Donetsk People's Militia with dedicated Russian troops, backed by air-powered drones, helicopters, and all the rest of it. This would, for reasons I don't have time to go into, Danylo, would be a military game changer and a political game changer. It would it would enable the Russians to put immediate pressure of greater kind on Ukraine whenever they wanted to. And you could accompany this with attacks that are simply designed to sow terror. The problem, unfortunately, in the Pentagon and many other places, is that everyone is calculating this against a baseline of a major offensive and holding ground. They don't understand that for the Russians, terror and destruction are serious aims in themselves, even if they don't produce something in positive terms. When have they ever produced something in positive terms? Well, I'll close with that rhetorical question.
I thank you, James. I don't pretend that we Ukrainians understand Russians too, but nevertheless, it makes it makes sense what you say, that terror and destruction are the aims themselves. And here, James, just a quick follow-up to what you said. We have President Zelensky right now in Paris. Don't you think that the whole military buildup, which is near Ukraine's borders, can influence the tactics of the Normandy 3 to accept somehow the narrative and the demands of Putin?
Surprisingly, I'm less worried than you. Even French and German friends of mine who are deeply critical of Macron and Merkel respectively, they all say privately the messages being delivered are very, very tough. The wisdom of delivering tough messages in private, but publicly calling on both sides to deal and using all this language of mush, the wisdom of this is completely beyond me, and it's very destructive and demoralizing in itself. And if Ukrainians are demoralized by this kind of language, I don't blame you. And what's being left out by these leaders is a necessity to educate their own people into the realities they face and what Russia actually is, particularly because this might escalate. But just one last point I want to throw in. I have to say I am worried by the combination of truly draconian sanctions, if we see them, and both David and Diane made it clear these are not yet at that level. I worry about the combination of that and perceived military weakness on our side. I think what the United States does has to have a military component. And this is not just signaling, but there has to be a military component that says to Putin, careful, because you are going to find yourself in territory that could be very uncertain and hazardous for you. And I'm not sure, I do not see us doing that at the moment. So I'll leave it.
Thank you, James.
Yeah,
let me tell you that I feel proud of my nation that is not demoralized by those difficult, terrible challenges that we are going through. But nevertheless, it's very natural for any human being to be afraid of further deaths, murders, killings, blood, and so on. So for that, many Ukrainians in Ukraine fighting for their statehood and independence, they still think about what might be a strategic solution. I mean, how to move ahead, how to move forward. And here, let me turn to Ms. Kalniete, to our Latvian and European friends and sister in arms, I would say, if I may.
Yes.
As media reported yesterday, before they started the meeting in Paris, the senior representative of the French Foreign Ministry underlined the importance of supporting Ukraine, but also stressed that it doesn't mean Ukraine is to become a member of the European Union. So we support Ukraine, but it's not necessarily that Ukraine must be a member of the European Union. Taking out of context, this point sounds definitely irrelevant under these conditions. But there is something symptomatic about it. One should realize that Russia will never change its attitude towards Ukraine unless Ukraine is a part of the collective West, NATO and the European Union. Ms. Kalniete, Madam Minister, how do you see the strategic solution to our common relations with Russia, and what do people think about it in the European Parliament? You're welcome.
First of all, I would like to say that Parliament is always much more supportive to any developments which need political will than governments. And the true friends always are in the Parliament, but that is a political support. The real decision making is what governments decide. And of course, we are having association agreement with Ukraine, but from my own experience, I want to repeat again, don't listen to all these statements like the one you mentioned yesterday from France. When we were on our way to European Union and NATO, so many times we have heard these statements. The most important is that you, Ukrainians, you know your way, that you make your choice, because international politics and situation changes, and you must be ready to put in your hand the moment when the door just small size opens. I consider personally that it is long time overdue to grant membership, NATO membership action plan to Ukraine. It was promised and it has to be done. And you can count on support of Baltic states, Poland and other states who entered NATO during recent period, because we know by our own experience how important is this first rapprochement with NATO and then the entry into NATO, what kind of security it provides. Even membership action plan already is a strong political message, but it is about political will of NATO member states. And I hope that they will hear us who are supporting Ukraine, because Ukraine, that is also security of European Union, security of NATO member states. And all those all those allies who are hesitant because they believe that they still have to find a way to placate Russia. I insist we can no longer politically hide behind the excuse of wanting to avoid angering Russia. We must see the Russian regime for what it is. A threatened, insecure dictatorship that keeps its power through aggression against its neighbor and against its own people. And we have seen this scenario play out before us before, and we cannot afford to see it happen again. And it is absolutely clear that the existing diplomatic frameworks, such as the Minsk Agreement and various OSCE mechanisms, are being blatantly disregarded by Russia. And also Normandy Forum, it's not the right framework. Russia refuses to participate in relevant meetings, refuses to disclose information that would help cool the tensions, and cynically presents itself as a neutral observer to the conflict. And that's why international society, we have to be very clear in our messages, because my adult life I spent in Soviet Union, and I know that this successor of Soviet Union, Russia, it counts only with a strong and clear language and also military force behind that language. Sorry to be so blunt.
Thank you. Absolutely, you are absolutely right, Madam Minister, and I do thank you for your remarks. Now I turn to Diane Francis. Yesterday, and just to continue what we discussed, what we discussed a few minutes ago. Yesterday, you made an interesting, quite paradoxical point in your latest article. You wrote for our audience to explain. I will quote it. Imagine you were Putin in the White House. President Putin, you say, would give NATO membership to Ukraine immediately. place American and NATO troops there to protect it against a threatened Russian invasion, shut down the gas pipeline to Germany at once, and so forth. So how do you see the strategic solution that I just asked our other distinguished panelists? And what do you think, how can we achieve this strategic goal, preserving the democratic rules and principles of the United Europe and not becoming a collective Putin? You're welcome.
Well, you don't have to become a collective Putin, but you have to play in his battleground. And his battleground doesn't have any ethics or morals. So when you're engaged in him, I think we're in a post-diplomatic place concerning Russia. Diplomacy, blah, 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 agreement summits, all silly, doesn't work, hasn't worked. And as Einstein said, if you keep repeating the same activity and think you're going to get a different result, you're insane. So I think a whole reframing has to happen. This is the Cold War. Ukraine is the line in the sand between civilization and Mr. Putin, who is not civilized. Actions, not words. NATO membership immediately, or de facto NATO membership if it's too difficult for the Europeans to get their heads around. De facto NATO membership would include all kinds of privileges, benefits, and troop help and weaponry. You also have to, you also have to look at the fact, and you have to shame Europe. Ukraine is the poorest country in Europe on a per capita basis with the biggest army. It is making the greatest sacrifice of any country in Europe since the Second World War to defend Europe. It is defending the Eastern Wall, the poorest country in Europe. I think that the European Union and NATO should pay the entire defense bill for Ukraine, thereby making them a deputizing them as a de facto NATO member, and recognizing the sacrifice that Ukrainian people are making, because it's not their fault that Putin is Putin. But diplomacy, we're past diplomacy. This does not work. And Mr. Putin underscored that yesterday by actually just defying Biden's request for de-escalation by banning naval shipping in the Black Sea. He already has abrogated any de-escalation hopes. And so I think that we have to be tough because he's tough. And, I don't think this is going to bring about the Third World War. But I think we can play the game just like he does. We have to think like Putin and be ruthless.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you for this optics. I believe this is important for our politicians to have the same optics as you have. And now I will ask James. In his conversation with NATO Secretary General on the 6th of April. James? James is somewhere. David, let me continue. Voice, yes. I beg your pardon. James, please switch on your mic. James, are you okay?
It's switched on.
Good. I hope that our audience will pardon us. I mean. Good,
yep.
James. So,
we're also
in his conversation with the NATO Secretary General, President Zelensky said, I quote, NATO is the only way to end the war in Donbas. Ukraine's membership action plan, NATO's membership action plan, will be a real signal for Russia. These words obviously raised the hysteria in Moscow. Do you believe in Ukraine's membership in NATO? And how do you see the necessary solution to restore Ukraine's security and territorial integrity, ensure stable peace in our part of Europe, and transform the relations with Russia? You're welcome.
What I have to say will not be popular amongst our distinguished panelists, and I'll put it in three parts. First, I think that President Zelensky's statement sent the worst message to the Kremlin. And I don't mean because it was provocative, quite the opposite. What he said to the people in the Kremlin who are serious and who listen, not the people on RT and the people in the RIA Novosti, is, look, we're helpless. We can't deal with you except as part of NATO. And this is, of course, what a lot of them believe and want to believe. This is the worst thing they need to hear. It's the worst thing the Ukrainian people need to hear. The fact is, in 2014, before there was even a hint of a sanction, or barely, Ukraine's cobbled together forces by August 2014 had the insurgents encircled and on the point of destruction. Nothing depresses me more than to hear Ukrainians underestimate themselves and underestimate Ukraine. That's point one. Number two, the fact of the matter is NATO is not a club. It's not about belonging. It's not about deserving to be there. It is a military alliance. It is a military alliance which is only effective if you have 30 allies who are really determined to risk war with Russia, with its nuclear weapons, in defense of another country. And I have to say, I don't like saying it, if the issue of the Baltic states membership came on the table after the Russia-Georgia war rather than before, I'm not sure what the result would have been. Today, the reality, the political reality, is 30 NATO allies cannot even agree that sending weapons to Ukraine is a good idea. Well, how on earth is it remotely in the bounds of political realism to imagine these same 30 allies are going to invite Ukraine to actually be a member? And my third point is that NATO membership in the foreseeable future, and I'm not questioning the ultimate goal of it, but in the foreseeable future is not necessary. What matters, and it's been said several times, is that an algorithm be found, and we've come close to it, that deters Russia, that preserves Ukraine, whose existence even in the past 3 weeks has been threatened again by three high-level people. Three high-level Russians have spoken about the destruction of the Ukrainian state, and which provides a basis for recovering its territory and maintaining its integrity after that. And that involves, as I said, an algorithm. It means let the NATO consensus do what the NATO consensus is willing to do and deepen it and intensify it. Today, this is focused on training and advisory work, network building. This is an extremely close and interwoven relationship. And then individual allies can go much further. There is nothing in the NATO treaty that prevents the United States, if necessary, from putting boots on the ground in Ukraine and defending Ukraine. Kuwait was not a member of NATO when all these states got together and decided we will defend Ukraine, or we will defend Kuwait and go to war with Iraq. The Washington Treaty is not a constraint on what allies do. The United States, Canada, the UK, Sweden, in its quiet way, even Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania. These are countries which individually and together can do much more than they're doing now. And there is probably a political will and consensus to do it. And better that they do it and to help be effective than everyone be bogged down in this NATO machinery which cannot agree about so many other things. So this debate needs realism. It needs to be put into proportion, and I'm afraid we are still far from that. We must change the terms of this debate. I'll leave it at that, and now you can all criticize me.
Not necessarily, James. Not necessarily, but nevertheless, let me say, if I understand you correct, you say that Ukraine may have its own security way. But Ukraine has already done that mistake before when it, as we see, signed the Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine had the third nuclear arsenal and it gave it out for, as we understand, for nothing. Don't you find that this is true?
Well, you make another point, which makes my point. Of course, the Budapest Memorandum was not a treaty. Read it, please. It's not there. Its greatest sanction is we'll appeal to the UN Security Council. This is not a military alliance. But it makes it clear that in the end, as a former German chancellor said, treaties are just pieces of paper. No NATO ally will be defended by Article 5. Article 5 is a form of words. The only thing that produces defense is capacity and force of political will. And that's what we all, with Ukraine, need to be building collectively amongst ourselves. It doesn't matter whether the defense comes with a NATO hat or comes with some other. Okay, so...
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah,
Thank you, James. Diane, I will be back in a second, if I may. I beg your pardon. But I would like to ask David Kramer, would you agree with what James is saying? And by the way, you were among the co-signers of the 12 points to strengthen the strategic partnership between the United States and Ukraine. And Ukraine's accession to NATO was a principal element of that appeal. In your opinion, how should Ukraine proceed, and how should Ukraine use the crisis we are going through for the benefit of its security, sovereignty, and further perspective? You are welcome.
I'm a strong supporter of NATO welcoming Ukraine into the alliance. I have been. I was in the U.S. government when the Bush administration pushed for a map for Ukraine and Georgia in 2008. But that experience is rather telling. The United States was firmly in support of MAP for both countries, and we did not succeed. NATO is a consensus alliance. And so in order for there to be a possibility for Ukraine to join, all 30 members need to agree, and that is not going to happen right now. I agree with James. I would love to see Ukraine and Georgia already in NATO. The reality we're facing right now is they're not, and they're not going to be anytime soon, particularly in light of this crisis. I don't say that with any satisfaction or happiness. As James was too, I'm trying to inject some realism here. And the reality is that I think the push for NATO right now is a bit of a distraction from what is a graver crisis, which is the possibility that Russia will move in a major way militarily into Ukraine. There's nothing stopping the United States from making Ukraine a major non-NATO ally, but that isn't the equivalent of Article 5 security guarantees. The United States has provided significant assistance to Ukraine, Javelin missiles and other defensive lethal assistance, and I credit the previous administration for reversing the wrong decision of President Obama to deny Ukraine that assistance. President Trump made the right call here. And there are no restrictions, by the way, on where those javelins can be positioned. There is a misunderstanding that they can only be kept in the West. That's not true. So the United States has been supportive. Ukraine has not asked for the United States to send troops to be on the front line. I would support what James said, which is what we should be doing, however, is helping Ukraine defend itself. As Diane said, Ukraine is the frontline state right now, dealing with an incredibly aggressive enemy. I don't think there's any other way to describe it. This is, of course, not a civil conflict. It is a Russian war against Ukraine, and we need to recognize that. But I do worry that while Ukraine now, I think, does have the support of nearly every member of NATO right now, if we inject into that a debate about whether Ukraine should be brought in as a member, we will fracture the alliance. And I don't think that'll be healthy right now. Georgia, too, is having its problems. And having Georgia join right now would also, I think, cause further division. So let's support Ukraine every way we can. I agree with the criticism about the ships into the Black Sea. We should be sending naval vessels into the Black Sea, and we shouldn't allow Russia to try to defy the Ukrainian Navy from sending its ships in. We have to keep the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea open to navigation, and we can do more bilaterally. We should do more together, but where we have to, we should act alone. But I do worry that this discussion about NATO, again, I support Ukraine joining NATO, but I think right now is maybe not the right time to have this debate.
Thank you, David. And I saw that Diane would like to contribute to this short debate that we have right now. 2 minutes, please.
Okay, sure. I was interested that James agreed with what I said. What we need to provide them is with de facto membership in NATO. That is to send troops, send money. Europe should be paying their defense bills. Send the Navy into the Black Sea. Send Black Ops in to cause trouble. You know, we should have our own Wagner operations going on against the Russians in that territory if we don't already. And this is all unofficial. This is under the diplomatic, you know, blah, blah, that actually gets nowhere because Putin knows how to play it better than the diplomats do. He agrees, he shakes hands, he attends summits, he makes deals, he doesn't agree with and abide by anything he agrees to. So I think it's time for us to think like Putin, and I think that we have to give them de facto NATO membership in deed and in terms of money.
And I know we're running out of time, and I have great respect for Diane, but I have to disagree. We are better than Putin. We should act better than Putin. We should do the right thing, which is defend and support Ukraine, but let's not get in the gutter with Putin.
I thank you, David. So we are almost at the end of our talk, and I would like to invite Mr. Yatsenyuk to make his concluding input into our discussion. As Ukraine's wartime prime minister and the member of the ruling coalition in 1419, you must remember many attempts of Russia to escalate the security situation, as we all remember. Russia tests the ability of the West, including Ukraine, to defend. So how do you see how to protect Ukraine and the West strategically if we see that there is even a discussion whether to include Ukraine into NATO or not? You're welcome.
Well, here is the thing. There is a debate over whether we need to think like Putin or to act like Putin. This makes a huge difference. We have to think and to act like normal people who really believe in the values of the free world. But what we definitely need, we need to know what Putin thinks and how Putin is to act. And this is an aggressive political beast which wants to restore the Soviet Union, which posed the threat to everyone in this world. And it's of crucial importance for us to realize that the time for ritual or diplomatic dancing is over. We have to act. Real deliverables, tangible deliverables, real acts and bold acts in order to stop the aggression of Putin. And let me be very clear on the NATO perspective issue. Look, it's a different track. On the one hand, strategically, I strongly believe that the only chance for Ukraine to preserve its independence in the long run is to become a NATO member. But tactically, for today, what we need supply of lethal weapon, military assistance to make Ukrainian military stronger and durable, to defend Ukraine, to stop Putin, and to protect Europe.
I thank you, Mr. Yatsenyuk. So I would like to thank every panelist, every participant, distinguished participant for being with us and for making your important points. What we understand, Russia cannot win this war. And for Ukraine, in my opinion, it depends on how quickly Ukraine can build a strong and just system to become an integral part of the collective West as we understand it. And this actually would be our greatest victory. But we definitely need the collective military support. And we definitely need to be a NATO member. I thank you very much for this discussion. Дуже дякую і до нових зустрічей.
Thank you.